Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Sony E-mount 18-135mm F3.5-5.6 OSS lens. A lot of times when people think of a kit lens, they have a really negative connotation, some kind of really cheapo, plasticky lens that, a camera manufacturer will throw in with cameras at an inexpensive price so someone has at least something to shoot with until they can afford something better. If that's the kind of impression you have in mind when it comes to kit lenses, you probably need to throw that out the window when it comes to the 18-135mm. This was a newer lens, though it's not a new lens any longer. I just happen to be reviewing it now because I purchased a kit with a Sony a6600 with this lens included, and I thought, well, I might as well review it while I have it. And so I actually spent some extensive time with this lens and used it as my not only primary, but only option on a recent trip to Texas where I needed to travel really light. You know how it is with airports these days. I wanted to deal with as little slowdowns as possible. And so I had this only packed with me. And so I took many hundreds of photos with it in a wide variety of situations and really came home with not only a good feel for the lens, but a really good feeling about the lens when I looked at the quality of photos that I was able to get. Because this is a newer lens and also a different kind of kit lens. This is not a kind of kit lens that you're going to find for a couple of $100. This is a lens that retails independently for about $550. And so that means that it's at a different kind of price point because it's at a different quality level compared to some other type lenses. And so in this case, Sony has really put a lot of the ingredients that you would want in a lens like this, outside of, more advanced things like weather sealing, for example, which I would love to have in a travel-oriented lens, but unfortunately not here. But we do have a better quality of autofocus, quite a decent build, and, fairly good image quality. Now, I say fairly good because we'll break that down in just a moment. Overall, for a, variable aperture kind of super zoom type lens, we actually have quite good image quality here, and it's perfectly easy to get very good quality photos in a wide variety of settings with this lens. At the same time, I don't want to oversell the lens and make you think that you're getting like, a bag full of primes in a tiny little compact lens. It's not quite that good either, but I hope to give you a realistic expectation of what you can see out of this lens as we break things down in this review today. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So let's start by giving you a closer look at the build, handling, and features of the lens. We'll dive in and take a closer look at that. So the 18-135 is a pretty standard looking, Sony consumer grade lens. It doesn't feel like plastic fantastic, but neither does it feel premium. So it does have an AF/MF switch on the side, which is always welcome to have. And then you have your zoom ring and your focus ring. The zoom ring moves fairly smoothly. You can see that the inner barrel does extend, about 2.5–3 centimeters upon full zooming out. But at no point does this really become a large lens. There is no evidence of a gasket here at the lens mount, nor any kind of claim of weather sealing. The included lens hood is, plastic, nothing special about it, but at least Sony does include it. If this is a Canon lens, we would be looking at that as a separate accessory. A front standard pinch cap, and you have a 55mm front filter thread. This is a variable aperture zoom lens, so at 18mm, maximum aperture is f3.5, and then a little bit later on, much sooner than what I would like, maximum aperture is only f5.6. This lens does come with Sony's optical steady shot, and it does seem the system works very well. It works quietly and smoothly. The lens itself is moderately sized. It is 67.2 millimeters in diameter. The overall length is 88 millimeters and the lens weighs in at 326 grams. It has 7 rounded aperture blades inside, which do a reasonable job, though, not top tier, of keeping a circular aperture shape. Sony a lot of times will use a much higher aperture blade count for its more premium lenses. You can focus as close as 45 centimeters and get a very useful 0.29 times magnification. Now, most often this lens is going to be sold in kit with a camera where you can get it at a more discounted price. If you're paying the full pop for it, it is nearly $550. So it's not a cheap lens for certain. And as noted though, for many people, they'll get it in a kit and will get a cheaper price for it because of that. Overall, a nicely made lens that held up just fine for me on an extended trip. I was at the beach with it down at South Padre Island in the southern tip of Texas, and I did have some sand and a little bit of salt on it. I cleaned it off and everything is just fine. So it's not weather sealed per se, and it's not, top tier in terms of build, but it seems to be durable enough for travel and situations like that. So as you can see, it really is. It's not like a obviously a pancake type of lens. It's a pretty big focal range and allowing you to get from, quite wide to, a fairly narrow telephoto viewpoint. And so because of that, it's not like tiny, but at the same time, it is really nicely compact. It fits very easily in a camera bag. If you hang it around a strap of some kind, you can wear it all day and, not wear yourself out. And so overall, I think that the quality here is good, and I was very pleasantly surprised. I'm kind of finicky about my gear, truth be told, and so when I was at the beach and I could see salt getting on there and there was sand and it was just, I had no way of getting things clean. It was really starting to bother me, but I just kind of washed things off and no problem. And it looks like new once again. And so I really do appreciate the quality of the build that is here, even though it lacks some of the features that I do prefer. One thing that I will throw in is that when I was in South Padre down in Brownsville, Texas area, that it's very, very humid there right on the Gulf of Mexico. And I did find that it took a long time for that kind of fogging up of the elements to dissipate. I don't shoot enough in an environment like that to know if my better gear with weather sealing would do better in an environment like that. But certainly if you shoot in very, very humid or very, very dusty environments, that's where having weather sealing becomes all the more important. So what about the autofocus? As I noted previously, this has a much better than, kind of bargain basement kind of autofocus system. It's got linear motors and it works very well. We'll dive into a little segment where we talk about that. So let's talk about autofocus. The 18-135mm, being a newer lens for Sony, definitely has an upgraded focus system compared to previous kit type lenses. In this case, we do have a linear motor, and Sony's linear focus motors are generally excellent, which is true here. We've got fast, quiet, accurate autofocus that I've now used in a wide variety of situations, and I have really nothing but good to say about. Things like IAF and PET IAF work just fine. It's easy to to detect an eye, to track an eye across the several camera bodies, A6400, A6600, and even on my Alpha 1. And I'm actually filming on it right now, and so you can get a sense of also how it tracks my face during this video segment. If I do something like approach the camera, it does so with a good degree of accuracy, staying with my face and moving appropriately without any kind of obvious stepping. So this is a much more sophisticated autofocus system than what you might have seen on a previous generation Sony kit lens. And as a result, it really does add to the sum total of the usability of this particular lens. I haven't found that there was enough speed that I was able to track some action, get a few birds in flight, various things like that. And so, overall, I think that this is a lens that is not really going to disappoint anyone when it comes to the autofocus performance, which is definitely a plus if you're considering this lens. And so, as you can see, a very strong performance from the autofocus, and I really have nothing but good to say on that front. So when you talk about the image quality in a super zoom like this, you have to recognize the reality that this is a lens that is basically one series of compromises after another. And the reason why I say that is that engineers, they're engineering for an 18mm lens, you know, in this case about a 27mm full frame equivalent. I mean, that's quite, you know, wide angle. And so there are certain, you know, kind of considerations you have to deal with in engineering for a wide focal length. But of course, going out to 135mm, that also means that you're dealing with, you know, roughly a 200mm telephoto full frame equivalent. So that has a completely different set of challenges. And the fact that you've got to engineer for all the focal lengths in between means that you have to find ways to cut corners and to make things work to where you can get a reasonable performance throughout. Fortunately, as we're going to see, you get a fairly consistent performance throughout the range with a little bit of fade towards the end, but with still very usable end results. Let's dive in and let's take a look.
Now, as a first-party lens, the 18-135 gets the benefit of having excellent profile corrections. And so if you are looking in on a JPEG or in video or even pretty much any kind of software at this point is going to have the profile for raw images, you can see that at 18mm things correct quite nicely. And so you might be tempted to think that there really isn't a lot of vignette or distortion. If that is your assumption, you would be wrong. At 18mm, this is what things look like if you turn off corrections. Now, you're going to note that here in the extreme corners, there actually is some mechanical vignette where it's just completely black. That tells you that this actually is, it doesn't fully cover, at this point, doesn't fully cover the image circle. And so what they've probably done is allowed it to be a little bit wider than 18mm to allow for a major correction of that. So even if you manually correct, you can see that it's basically almost impossible to manually correct perfectly because we do have this kind of wave pattern in the distortion. And so it takes a significant amount of correction to even achieve this result. You'll see that to achieve this result, I had to dial in a plus 59, which is a massive amount of distortion correction. Vignette, not as heavy, a plus 48, kind of a moderate result, plus 48 and moving the midpoint over to 0. Bottom line is that you really don't want to have to manually correct this. It is much better to allow the profile to do so. Now, by the time you arrive at the 34mm zone, you can see that there's much less distortion to deal with here. And so it's a much more natural type look, and so correction is much simpler. At 6-7mm, we've started to invert towards a bit of pincushion distortion, but again, you can see it corrects linearly, and vignette is not too bad. So again, not a major issue there. Now, at 135mm, actually somewhat surprisingly, we don't see a kind of a continued trend to where that pincushion distortion gets, you know, progressively worse and worse and worse. What we find here is that we have about a similar amount of pincushion distortion. Again, it corrects just fine, and vignette is actually not overly terrible, and so not really a bad result outside of that 18mm, you know, tremendous amount of barrel distortion there. So I'm doing my test on a Sony a6600, 24 megapixels, so we can see at 200% magnification in the center of the frame that sharpness is actually quite good. Contrast is good but not exceptional. That mild stop down to f4 gives us a little bit more contrast, but nothing significant here. In the mid-frame, we can see that our result is good. It's not exceptional, but it's still quite good. Decent amount of contrast. Detail rendering is quite good. Again, only a mild improvement in the stopping down to f4. Now, in the corners, you can tell that the acuity has dropped off. There's a little bit more mushy rendering of textures here, but and stopping down to f4 doesn't make a significant difference. Stopping on down to f5.6, however, makes a more marked difference in terms of upping resolution and contrast. And if we stop on down to f8, you get a little bit more still, to where you can get quite good results across the frame. If we pop over here, we can see that there's only minimal amounts of lateral chromatic aberration. Most of our transitions from black to white, they look just like black and white, and you can only see little traces of fringing there. And so for a kind of super zoom lens like this, that's not a bad result at all. Now moving on to 35 millimeters, the first thing I do want to point out is that we have very quickly progressed from f3.5 to f4.5. And so you very quickly, the maximum aperture starts to close down, which unfortunately is pretty common in lenses like this. It's part of how they're able to make them so small. What we can see though is, again, a very good result in the center of the frame, good contrast, good resolution. I would say a little bit more resolution here, stopping down to f5.6, and you can see you've got quite a good result, though not, hugely different than what you see wide open. Mid-frame result looks quite good, and then stopped on down to f5.6. It looks a little bit better still with superior contrast. And down in the corner, once again, our acuity drops off somewhat, starts to pick up again as you stop on down to f5.6. And we can see if you go from f5.6 on down to f8, that results are better still. And so a pattern is emerging that shows f8 as being kind of a sweet spot for getting maximum resolution across the frame. Now, our minimum aperture throughout this zoom range is quite small, and so in this case at 35 millimeters, it's f29, but you can see that this should be avoided at all cost. We have issues with diffraction that have basically robbed all of that contrast away, and all across the frame it looks like there is kind of a smear of Vaseline across the lens that really robs away all kinds of contrast. Now by 50 millimeters, maximum aperture has closed to f5, so we're getting towards the small end of the maximum aperture range. But what we can see is that we've got a very, very strong result once again at 50 millimeters, stopping on down to f5.6, further increases contrast a bit. Our mid-frame result, again, is quite consistent. It looks consistently good and a little better still at f5.6 in terms of contrast. Now down in the corner, I would say that we actually have more acuity here at 50 millimeters, a little bit more consistent performance across the frame, and at f5.6, contrast has improved to where the corners are very close to excellent already. In this case, stopping on down to f8 gives us a truly excellent result in the corner of the frame. Now by 70 millimeters, we are to our smallest maximum aperture of f5.6. We can see here at f5.6 that our center result is good, not as excellent as what we saw at 50 millimeter range, however. At f8, however, it looks quite excellent. Mid-frame quite consistently looks about the same with a mild improvement by f8. Now the corners actually look very good at f5.6, and I would say that there's not a lot more in the center of the frame than there is in the corner of the frame. The kind of the curve has flattened here for performance across the frame. Stopping down to f8 here only produces a mild improvement in contrast, not as significant as what we saw stopping down previously. It looks excellent, however. Now at 100 millimeters, we see a little bit of a drop in terms of acuity in the center of the frame. You can see it's just not as crisp in these details. A little bit of the crispness of them has been lost, and stopping down to f8 basically only gets us to the level that we saw wide open previously. Mid-frame, again, you can just see that some of the crispness of the details has been lost. There's a little bit more improvement at f8 where you can see some of those textures looking a little bit sharper again. Corner of the frame actually still looks fairly good, however, and stopping down to f8, only a mild improvement. Again, we kind of peaked somewhere around our 50 millimeter zone in terms of resolution across the frame, and we've seen a mild amount of drop. Let's see if that trend continues at 135 millimeters. So we see at 135 millimeters that basically the results are fairly similar to what we saw at 100 millimeters. They don't look worse, neither do they look better, just not quite as crisp as what we saw previously. And at f8, the results look good, but not as exceptional as the peak we saw of the performance in the zoom range. Mid-frame looks good, however, just not quite as crisp as what we have seen earlier on, and I don't really see much of an improvement at f8 here. We see a regression in the corners of the frame. Even at f8, you can tell that they're not nearly as sharp as what we saw earlier on, even at, say, 70 millimeters. Just to give you a quick glance back for comparison, here's what the corners at 70 millimeters looked like at f8 compared to what they are at 135 millimeters. So you can definitely see that we have lost a lot of acuity here in the corners of the frame. So at our minimum focus distance of 45 centimeters, we have a very useful 0.29 times magnification. And so obviously that allows us to get very close, and as you can see, the performance at a pixel level is good. Not exceptional, but very good. Contrast could be a little bit better, but in the sweet spot of the frame, it looks quite good. And I'll also say that it's a surprisingly flat plane of focus here, not too bad of a drop off towards the edges. This allows you to get obviously close to subjects, and if you're getting close, you're able to produce a decent amount of bokeh there and to blur out backgrounds nicely. Here's another shot that just kind of shows you, as you're falling off towards defocus, and you can see here that the subject actually looks nice and crisp here. This is a nice result that obviously gives you more versatility when traveling or using a all-in-one lens solution. Now here's a less extreme example of the bokeh in that the background is a little bit less defocused, and so you can see acuity's not off the charts there on this little beach bird walking along, but you can get a look at the background, and it's defocused fairly well. Now, obviously, those of you on a budget will want to use this lens for everything, and so we can see here that used as kind of a budget portrait lens, there's good detail in the faces. It's not going to give you that kind of professional cutout look that we sometimes see with, higher-end portrait lenses, but you can see that, it's not a bad end result here. And going back to this setting here, we can see that as we zoom in a little bit further, it's not quite as sharp, but you can see where this is the point of focus here, that we have got nice detail, and skin tones look fairly natural. Here's another kind of travel style portrait shot, and you can see that it's produced a nice result, even though in this case I did have to raise exposure a fair bit on the subject to balance out for the background. In more natural, neutral lighting here, you can see that we've got a really beautiful result. Good detail on my subject, and then also, the overall scene looks nice as well. Our real-world sharpness results when stopped down to landscape apertures are really quite excellent, and you can see that there's lots of detail here throughout this frame. It looks very, very nice. Here's another image with many textures in it, and so you can see that as we look across the frame, you can see some drop off towards the edges. It's very, very crisp in the center of the frame, but overall, taken at, looking at a global level, everything looks really quite fantastic. Here's another beach shot here, and you can see I was actually trying to get in the frame with this line of pelicans that was flying along. So you can see detail is really nice. As you get towards the edges of the frame, you can see that it starts to drop off a bit, however. I actually found that this lens was fairly flare resistant in real-world use, and so you can see here in the evening shooting into the sun, not really any kind of major ghosting artifacts, not really anything to see actually. It's really done a nice job with this, and also we can see that all along these bright points of contrast that there's not chromatic aberrations that are ruining the image either. Obviously, this was shooting fairly intensely into the sun and delivered me an image that I really, really love. And so I was impressed with this aspect of its performance. One final image, just kind of a street type shot, because this is what a lot of people will be using this for when traveling. And really, I was really pleased for it as a travel option. A lot of versatility in that focal range. And as you can see, we've got nice looking end results.
So, a bit of a mixed bag, a lot of strengths there, and of course a few, missteps. The most obvious engineering compromise that was made is the barrel distortion at 18 millimeters, which is pretty huge. Not unusual, however, compared to other super zoom type lenses that I have reviewed in the past. And as we also saw, you lost a little bit of that incredible sharpness towards the end of the zoom range, but still a really, really strong performance throughout. What really, I think, stood out to me the most was that I shot in a wide variety of situations, and I didn't really feel like I was losing out terribly. I'm accustomed to shooting with really good gear, and I own a lot of great lenses, and so I'm a little bit discerning, we'll say kindly, when it comes to image quality. And the fact that I came home with a lot of images from this trip that I was proud of and happy to, it's not like I felt like I was missing out and wish that I had other gear with me in a lot of situations. And so that really, speaks a lot to the usability of a lens like this. So if you're someone that wants to have a one lens solution, this is a great option. If you're someone who's looking for a great travel option for APS-C, also a great option here. And so I think that there's just a lot of applications where this lens is going to do really, really well. Now, obviously, if you need more specialized work, there's better options to be had on the wide end of things. There are better, portrait or telephoto options. There are better low light options in this lens, obviously. But at the same time, for a, jack of all trades, I can easily recommend the 18-135mm OSS lens from Sony. If you'll check out my description down below, you can find linkage to a photo gallery and a brief summary review there. There's also linkage to purchase one if you're interested there, some buying links there. There's also linkage down below to pick up some of my merchandise, to follow me on social media, to become one of my patrons and help support this channel. Also sign up for my newsletter that comes out every week. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.